War and Empire. There's no way around it. Whether Americans like it or not, the United States has become an enormous global empire. Obviously, U.S. government imperialism doesn't just look like, say, British government imperialism. In general, the U.S. government doesn't attempt directly to control millions of square miles of territory outside the borders of the territory it claims as its own. Instead, whether through military action, political manipulation, support for coup plotters, or economic pressure, it encourages the installation and continuance in office of regimes friendly to its interests. Sometimes these regimes seem relatively free, and sometimes they don't. What matters to the people who hold the empire's reins is to create and maintain a network of allies who can offer access to resources and markets, sites for military bases, and support for other strategic goals. Wars and empire go hand in hand. War is as common an instrument of imperial expansion as it is a means of defense. The story of the growth of imperial power is a story not of peaceful alliances, but of war and conquest. Alexander built the Macedonian Empire not with the understanding of philosophy he gained from Aristotle, but with his skills as a ruthless general. Rome dominated the Mediterranean world because its troops suppressed alternative sources of power and stayed to maintain order and threaten violence. Spain and Portugal fought, burned, stole, and enslaved throughout Latin America. Military created and maintained France's imperial presence in Western Africa and Southeast Asia. The sun never set on the British Empire because British troops conquered India, kept native peoples in check in North America and Africa, and patrolled the world on the ships of the incomparable Royal Navy. Consider the last 5 decades, and focus just on the United States. The U.S. government is hardly the world's only military power. It's hardly the only government to invade countries other than the one it claims to rule. But it's been the most powerful government in the world at least since the end of World War II. And that means that what it does has a particularly dramatic impact on other societies, and makes especially clear what states can and likely will do with military resources. The United States government wasted billions of dollars on its war in Vietnam, in which between 3 and 4 million Vietnamese people and close to 60,000 Americans died. Many Americans sighed with relief when the war in Vietnam ended, but it was obvious that militarism and imperialism hadn't gone away. The unintended consequences of imperial overreach in Southeast Asia included bloodshed and totalitarian oppression in Cambodia. Just a few years later, the Reagan administration was at it again, sponsoring thugs who tortured peasants and raped and murdered nuns. Then, of course, there were the First Gulf War and the imperialist intervention in the Balkans, masked as what Noam Chomsky labeled the new military humanism. The Bush administration launched a disastrous, unjust invasion rooted in lies, and it used its declaration of an open-ended war on terrorism to excuse domestic surveillance, indefinite detention without trial, and torture. Now, the Obama administration is ramping up the U.S. government's military presence in Afghanistan. There's ongoing talk about military activity into Pakistan. Hawks in Washington are still looking for excuses to attack Iran. And the U.S. is still trapped in the Iraq quagmire. America's one major party, the War Party. Commentators have blathered about a purported shift from hard to soft power. But state power is still, ultimately, the power to maim and kill. And the elites who want to use the power to extend their economic and political influence continue to set the agenda. They seem comfortably at home with both major American political parties. War isn't just a preoccupation of Republicans, Nixon, Reagan, Bush I, Bush II, or Democrats, Johnson, Clinton, now Obama. So instead of talking about the Republican Party or the Democratic Party as the culprit, we ought to focus on the real villain of the piece, the war party. States support war with flimsy arguments and dubious propaganda. Remember when Khanun Makia announced that U.S. government troops entering Baghdad would be greeted with sweets and flowers? When Colin Powell told the UN Security Council that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction? When Tony Blair said Saddam Hussein could launch a nuclear attack in 45 minutes? When the Bush administration announced mission accomplished? Mainstream pundits implied that there was no choice but to invade Iraq. The events after the invasion would proceed smoothly, that democracy would break out across the Middle East, that the benevolence of the coalition invaders would be universally acclaimed. The facts have been, to say the least, different, and the ongoing dominance of the war party means we can count on more unjust, pointless wars and more attacks on our freedom and our pocketbooks. On not sending the Marines. As I drafted the first version of this chapter, I was listening to a thoughtful anarchist commentator objecting to the U.S. government's attempted interference with the internal politics of another nation. What kind of interference? The passage of a non-binding resolution expressing the support for anti-government protesters in Iran. I think there's good reason to oppose this kind of resolution, but surely it's not because of any concern for any state's internal affairs. After all, for anarchists, all states are finally illegitimate. Their borders are arbitrary creations, their governments thugs in disguise or not. The fact that something occurs on the other side of a state border is no reason not to criticize it. People have every right to criticize injustice anywhere, and indeed we have good reason to actively oppose unjust state action anywhere. But notice that we're not really talking about opposition by principled individuals or groups. We're talking about opposition by government, the government of the United States. It's the most powerful government on the planet, with an enormous military and a history of active involvement in authoritarianism around the world. So when the U.S. government takes a position regarding protesters in the streets of Iran, it's hard not to see this as connected with the ongoing efforts to intervene in Iranian politics and install a more friendly government. That's why, as an anarchist, I oppose an official U.S. government position on Iran, not because I want the Iranian people to be ruled by the mullahs, but because I don't want them to be ruled by anyone, including puppets of the U.S. government. States, wars, and standing armies. I abominate and detest the idea of a government where there is a standing army, early U.S. politician George Mason once said. For Luther Martin, one of Mason's contemporaries, it was obvious that, quote, when a government wishes to deprive its citizens of freedom and reduce them to slavery, it generally makes use of a standing army, unquote. Elbridge Gerry described a standing army as the bane of liberty. Thomas Jefferson included a ban on standing armies among the fetters against doing evil which no honest government should decline. I think they were onto something. Standing armies, I'm using armies as a term of convenience to refer to all kinds of military forces, are armies not simply called up for defensive purposes in time of war, but maintained on a full-time basis by the state. In principle, of course, such armies could exist without states, and a state needn't have a standing army. So an argument against a standing army isn't a knockdown argument for anarchism. But there's a natural connection between standing armies and states. States can afford to maintain large standing armies because they can support them using tax money, Standing armies are more likely to attract members when they are maintained by states because states can spend enormous amounts to promote recruitment. In addition, states encourage people to join standing armies using propaganda that manipulates people's natural bent towards loyalty by focusing that loyalty on the state itself rather than on genuine local communities. By convincing people that it deserves their loyalty and that loyalty is best expressed through military service, the state can manipulate people into joining the military in a way that, say, a community association or firm that provided security services could not. The existence of standing armies makes it easier for states to fight wars. States need standing armies to drive their war machines. If a society features a voluntary militia to defend against invasion or violent civil unrest, the militia will do its work and then disband. Members of the militia will only participate in its activities if they believe it's doing something important. If it's defending their interests or those of their neighbors or friends, a standing army, by contrast, is ready to be deployed. A state doesn't have to wait for an attack or the threat of an attack to make use of its standing army. If it wants to invade another country, orders for the invasion simply need to be passed along its military chain of command, and full-time soldiers and sailors will begin to do the jobs they've been trained to perform. The existence of standing armies facilitates the manipulation of soldiers' loyalty. Personnel in a standing army are acculturated to think of themselves as performing invaluable tasks for their community, to trust and obey their superiors, to see what they do as an expression of loyalty. When the state snaps its fingers, they'll be likely to comply. By contrast, volunteer members of a militia are not primarily soldiers or sailors. They're teachers, electricians, accountants, steel workers, lawyers, journalists, and plumbers. They have their own lives to live. This means both that they are likely to be resistant to attempts to persuade them to give up their ordinary lives to participate in war, and that they will have had considerable opportunity to develop independent perspectives on what's going on in the world. They won't have been subjected to the constant propaganda reminding them of their role as guardians of freedom, democracy, or the homeland.